I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, in the largest attack on the capital city for many months, Russia bombs a children's hospital in Kyiv. We discuss this horrific attack. Elsewhere, we analyse Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban's diplomatic efforts in Kyiv and Moscow, and we examine Russia's hybrid war in Germany.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 8th of July. 2 years and 140 days since the full-scale invasion began, and today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls, Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes, Berlin correspondent James Rothwell, and our guests on the ground in Kyiv are Dr Jade McGlynn and security analyst Jimmy Ruston. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, hi David, and hello everybody. So the current chair of the United Nations Security Council has this morning bombed a children's hospital and a maternity clinic. Just let that settle in for a moment. So Russia launched a massive aerial strike this morning against Ukraine across the whole country, in particular Kyiv, Dnipro, Kryvyi, Sloviansk, Pokrovsk and Kramatorsk. The Okhmedit Hospital, which is Ukraine's largest children's medical centre, was hit. There'll be more on that in a moment. Another attack in Kyiv, reported just in the last hour, has hit the Asida Maternity Hospital, a private clinic. That's in Kyiv's Dniprovsky district. At least four people killed there. We haven't got a total yet for those killed at the Okhmedit Hospital. But as a result of the strikes overall, the numbers at the moment, over 20 reporters killed and 80 wounded. This comes from Ukrainian officials. President Zelensky says that about 40 missiles of various types were used throughout the attacks this morning. More than 10 explosions were heard in Kyiv. This comes from our colleagues at the Kyiv Independent. They had reporters on the ground there. Mayor Vitaly Klitschko said air defence has been active across the whole city and the suburbs. Kyiv Independent is saying that 12 locations in the capital were hit. More than 40 people injured as of a couple of hours ago, they're saying. It's gone up to 80 in the last thing I saw. That came from the deputy head of the presidential office. Now, particularly heavy blasts were reported in the centre of the city, near the area of the Taras Shevchenko Park. But the Okhmedit Hospital, which is in the sort of western edge of the city centre, was struck. Patients at the hospital have been evacuated to nearby facilities. Sergei Popko, the head of Kyiv's military administration, has said. Oliver Carroll, for The Economist, he's the foreign correspondent there, he reported a couple of hours ago that trucks of soldiers had headed alongside intensive care ambulances towards the hospital. He said smoke was billowing from the impact. He said it was the worst scenes in Kyiv for a year. He later spoke to a surgeon in the hospital who had been performing open-heart surgery at the time of the impact. The surgeon said he covered the child's body with his own and proceeded to stabilise her with a bypass device. He said, "We hoped for the best. There was chaos, glass flying everywhere." Now, President Zelensky, on Twitter, he said that Okhmedit has saved and restored health to thousands of children. Now the hospital has been damaged by a Russian strike. People are under the rubble. The exact number of wounded and dead is currently unknown. Everybody is helping out to sort through the debris, doctors and ordinary people. He continues, Russia cannot help but know where its missiles are flying and must fully answer for all its crimes against people, against children, against humanity in general. It is very important that the world should not be silent about it now and that everyone should see what Russia is and what it is doing. If you have a look at President Zelensky's Twitter feed, he's got some very graphic images there. They don't carry a warning on the images themselves, but I argue that they should do. But I think we need to look at these things. Children covered in blood and children we think possibly being treated for cancer, being treated in a car park nearby. Ukraine's presidential office chief Andriy Yermak said Putin believes that hitting our children should scare everyone and force the world to surrender. He shows that he can kill anyone he wants with impunity. The world has no right to remain silent. So that's the updates from the news, David, but I believe we might actually be able to hear from the ground.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. Jade McGlynn, thank you so much for taking time in your day to talk to us. You're in Kyiv. Can you just describe what you heard and tell us about the morning.
Thank you for having me. So a number of booms of air defence trying to shoot down what would have been the incoming missiles, and I can't help but think about those workers at air defence who obviously failed to shoot down those missiles despite trying very hard, and what they must be feeling looking at the images, which are obviously pretty devastating to see bored little children who are having cancer treatment having to be taken away from the hospital, which is, I suppose, like the equivalent of Great Ormond Street for Ukraine, to who knows where, because that was the major specialist hospital. And that's of the children, of course, who were lucky enough to survive. So that's what I heard, was the sound of incoming missiles. Then, of course, the hits, they were very loud. Naturally, as somebody who spends a lot of time in Kyiv, I thought that I had got quite used to the sound of explosions. But I found these particularly frightening. So I can't imagine, again, I almost don't want to imagine, but I feel like we have to, what the children and the poor parents in the hospital were going through. I mean, of course, it's really important that Western allies, and our governments say that they're standing with Ukraine, but today is one of those days where standing really doesn't do enough, given how much energy from the rage I think that one feels seeing those images. Standing doesn't give an outlet to that rage, and I hope that it can be channeled into more support and also a more coherent strategy for somehow improving the situation so that fewer of Ukraine's children have to, and their mums and dads have to live under this risk, because clearly whatever we've been doing so far, it's not doing the job, is it, to deter Russia. And
Jade, Dom mentioned the reaction in Kyiv, in the city, of people going to help out the hospital. What have you heard from your Ukrainian friends, and what have you seen doing the rounds in Kyiv?
So some people have gone to the hospital, of course, to help. A number of people actually went to the shelters, went to the metro for the first time in a really long time for them, because it was quite a scary series of explosions. Normally people here have got used to the bombings, but the metro was pretty busy. On the other side, I mean, some people, obviously, I have a lot of friends from East Ukraine, and it's almost equally as upsetting to see how upset so many of the people in Kyiv are, but also equally as upsetting to see how so many of my friends from the East are. I mean, of course, they find it devastating, but it's very hard to make any impact on them, because they live through so many awful things, perhaps not as awful as today, but so many awful things. And in general, one just has the feeling of a country that has just, and a society that has just been through far too much, and that there needs to be some, particularly as we think ahead of the NATO summit, there needs to start being some concrete options. Okay, I think we all understand, all of us who live in the world of, who pay attention to the world of politics, that nobody's going to offer Ukraine NATO membership. Fine. Can there be a discussion then of no-fly zones in certain regions? I mean, there needs to start being, for the sake of Ukrainian society, some kind of hope even to hang on to, that it will not just continue like this, just suffering after suffering, that there is some light at the end of the tunnel, even if it's going to be long, even if it's going to be arduous, that there is some road out of this. Because I don't see how anybody can expect society to just continue like this. And it always reminds me of the famous Churchill speech, where in Britain we always remember, we'll fight them on the beaches, we'll fight them on, in the hills. But we always forget the second part, which is, until in God's good time, the new world, i.e. America, comes to help us. And I think Ukrainians are probably, well, I'm certainly starting to wonder on their behalf, and I'm sure they're wondering, when is God's good time? Is his watch still working?
Jade, thank you so much. Jimmy Ruston, thank you so much for messaging in. Can you just tell us about your morning? Where have you been and what have you seen?
Yeah, so, funny enough, I was actually taking the morning off, and me and my girlfriend were going to see this exhibition at one of the Kyiv National Museums, and then there was the air raid alarm, and obviously there started missiles intercepted literally above our heads. At that point, she went to a shelter. I went back home to get my press gear, and I headed to the scene of the blast. particularly the hospital, which took a direct hit or nearly a direct hit from a Russian cruise missile. And we have seen footage now that's been circulating showing the cruise missile impacting with the hospital. And it wasn't shot down. It flew under its own power deliberately into this hospital. So it's almost incomprehensible, really. It's the second, well, there were two hospitals hit in Kyiv today. One was a maternity hospital. The second was this children's hospital, which, as one of your previous contributors, I think it was Jade, that said that it's the equivalent of Great Ormond Street Hospital. It's the kind of the national hospital for really, really sick kids. And when I arrived, there were a lot of really, really sick children being evacuated, kids that have obviously been going through chemotherapy, dialysis, some with IVs still in their arms, being carried out by their parents. So yeah, very, very difficult scene. Ukrainians were joining together and forming like human chains to pull rubble away from one of the destroyed buildings, which I think that the missile had hit directly. And yeah, it was a very, very difficult scene. And obviously, this is one of the most deadly attacks that Ukraine has seen, in Kyiv in particular, since February, when there was another big strike. But we haven't seen medical facilities in Kyiv being directly targeted before. That's definitely something new.
Jimmy, you mentioned you've been looking at some of the footage of the missile hitting the hospital. What does your work now as a security analyst look like? What kind of things will you be investigating and pursuing over the next few hours and few days? What will you be trying to add to the understanding of the situation?
Really, I mean, from in this perspective, I'm coming at this as more of a journalist, but I would say that these are very expensive missiles, right? Kinzhal missiles, hypersonic missiles, they used a Zircon hypersonic cruise missile as well, and they used a bunch of K-101 and X-101 cruise missiles. They're very, very expensive. They're actually relatively accurate for Russian munitions. They're actually quite good. The high-end stuff is pretty good. And they expended a lot of expensive military hardware, and one of them was flown deliberately into a hospital. Well, two of them potentially flown deliberately into hospitals. So you have to ask, what was the motive here? What was the military objective, if there was one? Or was it just a simple desire to try and terrorize Ukrainian civilians, residents of Kyiv, to try and show them that Russia still has this power to essentially destroy whatever they want in Ukraine at any period? And what better target if you want to terrorize people and intimidate people than to blow up a children's hospital, right? It's the ultimate expression of that just callous power over Ukraine. And yeah, it's not, I don't really think I could add really that much more than what we've already seen. And it's a children's hospital full of sick kids that has been blown up by an extremely expensive, very, very accurate, generally, missile.
Thank you, Jimmy. Just one more question from me. What do you make of the timing of this? A couple of days before the big NATO meeting in the US. Does that have much significance for you?
I would also say that obviously we've had change of government in the UK. We've had the British Defence Secretary went down to Odessa. He pledged a new significant military aid package for Ukraine. I do think Russia likes to remind Ukraine and the rest of the world that they are still capable of this, and they are still a very, very capable military force, and they shouldn't be underestimated. And to be honest, that to Western countries and NATO countries that are gathering together in DC, it should just spur them on to supply more military aid to Ukraine, to supply more air defense equipment, in particular to Ukraine, and to find ways that we can ratchet up the costs on Russia for this war of barbarity against the Ukrainian people.
Dom, can I come back to you for the final updates before we talk to James and Joe?
Yeah, certainly. There's quite a lot, so I will whiz through them. Most of the fighting over the weekend was in the Donetsk region. Russian forces said to have advanced into the southwestern suburbs of a town called New York, 20 k's north of Donetsk city. They're said to be about half a mile from the centre of town there. On Saturday, Ukrainian media reported that their soldiers in the area had been complaining of a lack of mechanised support. That push is thought to be part of a larger Russian offensive in the area that we've been reporting on for a few weeks now. Seems aimed at the coal mining city of Toretsk. We've spoken of that before. That's about 6 miles north of New York. This continues Russia's incremental gains in the east across the whole front. And for those wondering, it is actually New York. It was established by German settlers in the 19th century, said to have taken its name from the birthplace of one of the founders that was New York. So that's where it comes from. So it did change its name. It was given a different name under the Soviet Union, but changed its name. So it is actually New York. It's not a typo, and that's what you'll hear Looking more widely in the area, a number of, dozens of attacks over that area over the weekend. Ukraine said they repelled many of them and say they shot down an Su-25 jet. On Saturday night, Ukraine's security service, the SBU, was thought to have been behind drone attacks on 2 oil depots inside Russia in the Krasnodar Krai region. That's to the east of the Kerch Bridge region. That came from Ukrainian media, citing a police source. Earlier, Russian news outlets had reported drone strikes and said they'd started a large fire and damaged a communication tower. Ukrainian drones also hit a very large ammunition depot in Voronezh Oblast in Russia, about 200 kilometres northeast of Kharkiv. The ammunition depot was said to have contained surface-to-surface and surface-to-air missiles, ammunition for tanks and artillery and small arms rounds. I mean, it certainly contained something. It went up in a big old bang. A number of secondary blasts could be seen and heard on the social media footage. The overall blast was so big it was picked up by NASA. So NASA has this system called FIRMS, which is Fire Information for Resource Management. It's a near real-time satellite detection of hotspots around the world, wildfires and all that kind of stuff. Well, wildfires or exploding Russian ammunition warehouses, which picked up in this case. And then on Friday, pro-Ukrainian partisans claim they've blown up a railway line deep inside Russia that was being used to transport ammunition from North Korea. So the Artesh group, speaking on Telegram, said Artesh agents managed to carry out a successful operation on the Trans-Siberian Railway near Yekaterinburg. That's about 1,000 kilometres due east of Moscow. The group continued. They said, as a result, the railway track along which North Korean ammunition was being delivered was blown up. A spokesperson for Artesh said one of their Russian agents carried out the sabotage, but they added he's refused to be rewarded because he works for ideological reasons. His goal is to stop the criminal war waged by his country against Ukraine. There were some diplomatic updates as well, people zipping all over the place, especially with the new government here in the UK. But just a bit on the international front, on the diplomatic front, Chinese soldiers have landed in Belarus to take part in what they call anti-terror military drills, very close to the border with Poland, apparently. So Belarus's Ministry of Defence said that this 11-day joint anti-terrorist exercise will start today and is aimed at improving coordination between Belarusian and Chinese units. Chinese media said the exercises would be held in Brest on the Polish border. Now, Alexander Lukashenko, he's in the office of the Belarus president. That is largely thought to be an illegitimate post. The last election was widely seen by independent media as having been won by Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, who's in exile at the moment. We've had her on the pod before, and she's still fighting for Belarusian independence away from Russia and Lukashenko. But Lukashenko, he did meet President Xi Jinping twice last year. He's said to be very keen to expand trade ties and revive his economy that's been crippled by sanctions. But of course, it's all part of Putin's cozying up to China routine. Now, speaking of China, David Lammy, Britain's new foreign secretary, new as of last Friday, he said that he's warned China not to become further embroiled in Russia's attempt to attack Ukraine. He said Beijing should be very careful about its deepening partnerships with Russia, Iran and North Korea. He was speaking in Poland, where he's held 2 hours of talks with Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski. He's on a whirlwind tour. He'd previously been in Berlin, so that was his first visit. New Foreign Secretary's first visit went to Germany, which I thought was quite interesting. And he's expected to go to Sweden next. It is part of an outreach from the new Labour administration here in the UK. So as the Foreign Secretary has been on that jaunt, John Healey, Britain's Defence Secretary, he has gone straight to Ukraine. He said Britain will provide extra weapons to Ukraine and speed up the delivery of support already pledged. Now, he said that the previous government had pledged the last package of military aid that was in April. John Healey said that he's going to make sure that they're all delivered in the first 100 days of the new administration. He was down in the port city of Odessa. He promised more artillery pieces, the AS-90, the 155mm self-propelled gun, a load more brimstone missiles and lots of other bits and pieces. He was with President Zelensky as well, took part in Ukraine's annual Navy Day commemoration service, which happened yesterday. He made a speech, but time is short, but he was very resolute in Britain's continued support for Ukraine. And he promised that Britain's going to provide about 250,000 50 cal ammunition, so heavy machine gun ammunition, 90 brimstone missiles, 50 small boats for river crossings, demining vehicles, and another 10 AS-90, as I said, the 155mm guns. President Zelensky said he was very pleased to receive the Secretary of State for Defence and keen to continue work on the 100-year cooperation agreement between UK and Ukraine. I'll leave it there. I mean, there are other speeches from the Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, who was on the trip, but as you'd expect, and time being short, I'll move on from here, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for your updates there. James Rothwell in Berlin, can I come to you? You've been interviewing the head of domestic intelligence in Germany's Thuringia state, Stefan Kramer. Must have been a fascinating interview. What did he tell you?
Hi, everyone. Yes, it was a very interesting interview with Stefan Kramer. He's, as you said, the head of domestic intelligence. So we were largely discussing this from the perspective of attempted Russian sabotage plots in Germany and beyond, of which there have been a few. And I got from Mr. Kramer, I would say, an impressively frank assessment of the German domestic security situation. He said that Germany has become a, quote, battleground in Vladimir Putin's hybrid war on NATO, and he blamed that on decades of lax security in Germany. That's obviously changed a bit since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, though critics would say not enough, and a large number of pro-Russian sympathizers in East Germany, which, as we all know, used to be the GDR, a sort of communist satellite state. He also warned that Putin now views Germany as his prime target in that hybrid warfare campaign. Just to remind listeners, hybrid warfare is when you attack critical infrastructure, you meddle with elections, and you generally try to destabilize a country, for example, through cyber attacks as much as possible in order to humiliate that country, in order to basically weaken that country from within to a certain extent. And I think it was not surprising, but very interesting that a domestic intelligence chief would, as I say, be very frank about that. This is a security officer who I think recognizes the reality of the challenges in Germany. And the first step towards resolving those sorts of problems is, of course, recognizing in the first place and that something needs to be done. Now, he also said, Mr. Kramer, that Russia was feeding into feelings of chaos and delegitimization of public structures on all channels in Germany. That's an allusion in part, I think, to the rise of the AfD, this hard-right party in Germany, which is against sanctions on Russia, which is against military support for Ukraine. It came second in the European elections. And it speaks to a wider concern in NATO about hybrid warfare being waged on Germany and other countries. We saw that very strange, suspicious fire in the Diehl factory in Berlin a few weeks ago. Diehl, the wider defense group, is supporting Ukraine and is involved in the supply chains of certain defense technology that goes to Ukraine. And although initially the Germans said they thought that that fire was an accident, NATO allies have actually passed some intelligence to Germany. We don't know what it says exactly, but it states that Germany probably ordered that sabotage attack. So the wider context here is that there is this much wider campaign going on in which Russia is waging hybrid warfare, trying to destabilize certain NATO countries.
Just before we talk about Orban, I'd be curious, James. I mean, you live in Germany, you've worked in Germany for years. Do you feel like Germany is this battleground for hybrid warfare? Is that something that you think the general public are aware of? Or is this kind of, to some extent, why Kramer gave the interview, right, to raise awareness of that idea?
I think the German public are aware of that, but there is a debate, a rift, you could say, in German society about what it needs to do about this threat of hybrid warfare. I think it's fair to say that in the current German government, I think there's a reluctance to face up to the challenges because it would require an absolutely massive reform of the German security system if they wanted to keep Russian spies out of it entirely. I spoke to one official recently about the issue of security threats to Germany from Russia, and they talked about the fact that Germany is quite an open society that has a lot of briefing intelligence documents circulating about in the German parliament and its regional state parliaments, and the risk that things can leak out. For example, the embarrassing Luftwaffe leaks when some senior German Air Force officers were overheard talking about a potential delivery of Taurus missiles. Russia intercepted that conversation, leaked it. It would need to clamp down on the flow of information, and that would require quite a big change to the way that Germany's intelligence structures work. The other big issue here is that sometimes we forget, because Germany is now this sort of prosperous economic powerhouse, that half of it used to basically be under Russia's orbit. And the legacy of that continues today in East Germany. You've got lots of people flocking to vote for the AfD, which has a very sympathetic stance on Russia. In terms of their voting patterns, they're more likely to support parties like the AfD or BSW, a new populist left party, which are also quite sympathetic to Russia, who are in favour of perhaps lifting the sanctions or of not giving any more support. And what that creates is a fertile recruitment pool of German and sometimes German-Russian dual nationals who might be recruited by Putin to carry out some of these sabotage plots, which they seem to be drawing up. And I can give you an example of that. In Bavaria, quite recently, 2 German-Russian citizens were arrested as part of a wider plan to attack a US military site down in Bavaria, which supports Ukraine. So these plots are happening. It can be difficult to report on them in detail because there's a lot of secrecy around what exactly was happening and these cases. But it's a real threat. It's a real danger. And there are some in Germany who I think it's fair to say are facing up to this, and Mr. Kramer is definitely one of them. They are thinking about this in terms of a major issue that needs to be resolved. But there are other parts of the German government, critics of Mr. Scholz would say he's in this camp, who know that the problem is there, but there is a reluctance, partly due to domestic political pressure, partly due to fear of, in their eyes, provoking Russia, that holds them back from taking bold action from that. And of course, just to contextualize this with the strike on the Children's Hospital earlier today, this is a long-term problem. Lots of people I've noticed have been pointing out that had Ukraine received stronger air defense prior to this terrible attack this morning, they might have had the tools that they needed to shoot this down. It's difficult to be completely sure on that because we don't know what exactly may have gone wrong with Ukrainian air defense today. But I think it is fair to say that had there been more support from European allies, Germany being a very important one, the terrible scenes that we're seeing at the hospital may not have happened. And in that sense, I'm afraid this is all connected.
Thank you very much, James, for that. Talk to us about Viktor Orban. He's been travelling around to Ukraine, then to Moscow. What's he doing now?
Yeah, Viktor Orban, in the eyes of the European Council and Commission, has been a very naughty boy. He's gone off to Moscow. He was there on Friday, had a meeting with Vladimir Putin, styling himself as a sort of unbiased, even-handed potential peace negotiator. The European Union, to be clear, has completely distanced itself from this visit by Orban to Russia. He's, I think, one of only 2 EU leaders to actually meet with Putin since the war broke out. And that's part of a wider visit where, yes, he was in Ukraine, but he's also today in China. China has seized upon this as an opportunity to cause a bit of embarrassment for the EU, even though the EU slapped down Orban and said he's not representing the whole of the EU when he goes on these trips. China has endorsed what Orban is doing, which Orban says is this attempt to set up a kind of new peace process via Ukraine. And Mr. Orban gave an interview to Bild, a German tabloid, to one of their sort of star correspondents who spent a lot of time in Ukraine, who's seen on the ground the reality of the Russian war campaign in Ukraine. And as I said, Orban really tried to style himself as that even-handed negotiator. Nearly all wars in history, recent history at least, have ended in some kind of round of negotiations. So that might, on the surface of things, sound reasonable until you factor in the fact that this Hungarian leader has turned up in Moscow without the backing of other European leaders to hold the sort of first informal rounds, I suppose, of these peace talks. It's not quite clear what Mr. Orban wants to achieve, and it's worth stressing for context. This guy is considered, by and large, to be the most pro-Russian prime minister of the EU member states. He's opposed in large part to military support for Ukraine. He's opposed to the sanctions. He has a very cozy relationship with Vladimir Putin. So even if he's acknowledging the need at some point, perhaps in the future, to have a negotiated settlement to this war, he's not considered at all by the other EU leaders as an even-handed or impartial trader in that, due to their perception that he's too close to Putin. And again, an interesting choice of outlet. He's been doing a few media rounds, actually, but he chose to sit down with a German newspaper. He chose to extol the virtues of himself as a sort of peaceful mediator. Mr. Orban's team may have felt that the German public would be the sort of most receptive to this rather broad brush abstract idea of securing peace. But as we know, the problem with peace negotiations and Putin, and we saw this in particular in the Syria campaign, is that peace talks don't necessarily mean peace talks. They sometimes can just mean a pause in which the Russian side rearms and gets ready to break the ceasefire and then go again. And I think that's probably the underlying concern for many EU leaders when they see Mr. Orban sort of travelling around promoting himself as a peace mediator. They do not see this three-part foreign trip to Russia, Ukraine and China really as a serious attempt to secure a sustainable peace. They see this as a stunt, basically, by a Hungarian leader whom they suspect is much too close to Vladimir Putin.
Well, thank you very much, James Rothwell, for bringing us those stories. Dom, can I come to you just for some updates on the story we, of course, have been discussing, Dom Nicholls?
Yeah, I've been looking around while we've been talking, David, and the Ukrainian Air Force has put out a statement discussing what was fired at Ukraine this morning and what their air defence was able to shoot down. So it's a bit of a list, but please stick with us. So they say Russia fired one Kinzhal ballistic missile, which they shot down. Russia fired 4 Iskander-M ballistic missiles, of which Ukraine shot down 3. So one of those got through. Russia fired a Zircon hypersonic missile. That got through. They fired 13 Kh-101 cruise missiles. 11 were shot down, but 2 of those cruise missiles made it through. And of the 14 Caliber cruise missiles that were fired by Russia, 12 made it through. Ukraine's Air Force shot down 2 of those. 2 Kh-22 cruise missiles were not intercepted. They got through. And all 3 Kh-59/69 guided aerial missiles were shot down. So I think, 30 of 38 or 39 missiles shot down. I'm not saying that's a good percentage, of course, because we've seen the results that just one of these missiles can do. It shows the need for air defence. You've got to get all of them. There's no two ways about this. They need more air defence. Those are the numbers that Ukraine's Air Force have just put out. And as you can see, a very small number got through, and look at the devastation that they caused.
Well, thank you, Dom and James. Joe Barnes, for our final story today, before you head off to the NATO summit, can you talk us through your reporting on the future for Ukrainian children who are refusing to adopt Russian citizens?
Yeah, I'll first have a few thoughts on what we've seen above. Viktor Orban couldn't have been taken very seriously by Vladimir Putin if the first thing he does after Viktor Orban flies to Moscow and proposes some sort of ceasefires and drop bombs not only on the Ukrainian capital city, Kyiv, but also a children's hospital, obviously takes that deadly seriously. And then just some breaking news while we've been on air. Volodymyr Zelensky is not actually in Kyiv at the moment. He's in Warsaw, and he's just signed a bilateral security agreement, one of these long agreements, probably 10 years as well, like the Brits, like the Americans, the French, the Germans have all signed. But interestingly, this document that's signed between the Poles and the Ukrainians is unprecedented in nature, because it appears to have a clause in it, or at least a promise, that they're going to try and negotiate a provision for Polish defense forces to shoot down Russian missiles and drones in Ukrainian airspace if they are fired in the direction of Poland. So you'd know Rzeszów Airport, which is used for sort of vast amounts of the aid to Ukraine, that's guarded by many batteries of Patriots. Poland is one of the Patriot countries, so maybe that is going to be some sort of promise to look at, can those Patriots be used to help ease the burden on shooting down weapons fired towards Western Ukraine, so in the direction of that Polish border. So really interesting breakthrough. Yeah, but now back to what I've been reporting on over the weekend, or for basically all of last week, speaking to many people involved in this. And it's stories about Ukrainian children who are facing imprisonment in Russian adult prisons for refusing to adopt Russian citizenship. And this is part of Vladimir Putin's well-documented sort of program to abduct tens of thousands of children from Ukraine. He has been handed an ICC arrest warrant, and so has his so-called children's rights commissioner. And we wrote that in the piece with bunny ears, quotation marks, Maria Lvova-Belova. But yeah, so we've basically been looking at a number of young Ukrainians being held in special children's detention centres in either the occupied Ukrainian territories or just over the other side on the Russian border. These teens, I'll explain why in a minute. These teens are aged between 13 and 17, and researchers, activists, officials have basically expressed concern that when they turn 18, they're going to be destined for proper Russian prisons. The reason I don't reveal any details, I won't tell you their names, exactly where they're from, and that is because we don't want to harm what has become a race by activists to free these children ahead of their 18th birthdays. So because of the sensitive negotiation, I won't go into full detail, but I will tell you the story of one teenage boy who went missing after he left home for a walk early on in the war. His parents said Russian police told them that he had been detained for carrying out an alleged terror attack on the Russian state. The boy was taken to one of these children's detention centres where he was tortured into signing an admission of guilt for what his parents say is a phony crime. When his mother protested against the conditions of her son, who was left bloodied, bruised by the interrogation and with visible signs of electric shock, so sort of stuff that we've seen before when torturing Ukrainian soldiers, other prisoners, that is all happening to children as well. And his mother, when she basically protested about his conditions, was barred from seeing him. These children have all been snatched from towns, villages, cities, so near the likes of Mariupol, Melitopol, and other cities and areas that fell basically in the early months of Putin's full-scale invasion. And they're now being held in the likes of Mariupol, Sevastopol, and Russia's southern city of Rostov. And because they're refusing to take Russian passports, Russian citizenship, basically become Russian, because we know that part of Vladimir Putin's plan to eliminate the Ukrainian state is by basically changing its children to become Russian. So that's one of the real problems that they're facing. So Mariam Lambert, who is the founder of the Dutch Orphans Feeding Foundation, which is a charity, and she's involved in trying to help free these children. Her charity paid for families to retrieve children from Russia and assisted them as an intermediary all along the way. And she had this to say: the problem with these cases, you can have the best lawyer in Russia or Ukraine, but it's very difficult to dismantle the claims made by Russia because they are false claims. So or fake claims, sorry, that's talking about sort of these terror charges. And then let's look at more deeply the story about Ukrainian children. Ukraine estimates that nearly 20,000 children, so between 19 and 20,000 children, have been forcibly removed from occupied territories to Russia since the start of the invasion, but many thousands more are missing, and estimates go upwards of 100,000 for the number of children that have been kidnapped. Ukrainian officials and independent humanitarian workers divide these kidnappings into two categories. The first, as with the teenagers that I've mentioned and reported on, are detained on these phony charges that's intended to suppress children who are old enough to disagree with and then oppose Putin's invasion. They're just trying to silence people who are old enough to understand and potentially rebel from inside occupied territories against this invasion. The second type is motivated, they say, by genocidal attempts to wipe out the next generation of Ukrainians by making them Russian. So I recently attended an event and spoke with Andrei Kostin, the Ukrainian prosecutor general, and he had this to say: by targeting and stealing the next generation of Ukrainians, Russia is manifestly demonstrating a brutal extinction policy against the Ukrainian people, implemented alongside the widespread and systematic campaign of torture, ill treatment, and unlawful confinement of civilians in occupied territories. In many of these cases, children have been taken from orphanages and children's assistance homes, homes for significantly severely disabled children. So Mr. Kostin went on: Russia does not act randomly. It's a pattern of repeating behaviour. Since February 2022, Ukrainian children are being gathered from childcare institutions across occupied territories and displaced as far as possible from their motherland in Russia. Some children are taken directly from family or separated from their parents in filtration camps organised by the Russian armed forces and then moved to Russia proper. The fate has been similar for those children whose parents died during sieges of Ukrainian cities or in the course of urban hostilities. They fell into the hands of occupying authorities. He's basically saying that, his words speak for themselves really, but he's saying that Russia is trying everything it can to get hold of Ukrainian children, whether it be taking them from orphanages, promising the parents that they're going to be taken to safety, they're going to be taken to summer camps well away from the front line. That's another well-known tactic. But what has been found by many researchers, other journalists as well, as not just myself, is the children are later being put up for adoption on Russian government websites, often with falsified Russian identities, including fake names, date of births, and no mention of their Ukrainian backgrounds. So I've been speaking to someone who is independently tracking those listings, and he has found 35 potential adoption adverts that match that description, which goes well above the official estimate. Officials, charity workers, they're using a host of sophisticated software to scrape these Russian adoption databases. They're using image recognition tools, public records to confirm findings. parents, the Dutch government have been very good in this. The parents are being urged to take DNA tests, and the Ukrainian state is being trained of how to keep these DNA tests in ethical ways to make sure that there is enough evidence to help bring these children back. But bringing these children home is considered a race against time, with many of them adopted before their first birthdays. They will have no recollection of their parents or Ukrainian heritage, or even who they are, effectively. And as they grow up, it's going to become harder to identify them. So Daria Zarivna, who is a Ukrainian presidential aide, a deputy to Andrei Yermak, but she's also the head of Bring Kids Back Ukraine, which is like the official body and official campaign efforts to facilitate bringing kids home. She said time is playing in Russia's favour. That means the longer we drag our feet and play to Russia's demands, the harder it will be to recognise these children later. So it's not just Ukraine, there's a bit of an international effort. Both Qatar and the Saudi Arabian governments have helped act as intermediaries between Ukraine and Russia. The Gulf states, as well as charities, have funded sort of independent trips for Ukrainian parents who have travelled through checkpoints between Ukraine and Russian-held territories and on to Russia, sometimes be reunited with their children. But these efforts are slow. We think that around 400 children have been returned out of the 20,000 official estimate. And it's going to be a challenge that's going to continue to plague Ukraine long after this war has finished. So Marianne Lambert's had this to say: even if the war stopped tomorrow, there will be work for the next 10 years because these children need to be found, these children need to be rehabilitated and reintegrated. And actually, I think a really important comment that she made, for some, I can't even say reintegrated, because we are not talking about children who have disappeared from 2022. We are also trying to return children who were taken from 2014, that's around Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine, the start of the war, as most people put it, who need to be completely integrated into Ukraine. These are probably children who have been born under occupation and never actually stepped foot on Ukrainian-held territory for the entirety of their lives. And that is, it's a real challenge. It's really harrowing. I found myself saying that this is some fascinating details, but then you have to take a step back and realise this is actually going on. This is crazy. And it only builds the narrative of what Russia are doing that is just incredibly wrong. They are blowing up like children's hospitals, but also kidnapping children as well. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for taking us through your reporting. We'll come back to you in our final thoughts, I think, and do tell us a little bit about what the next week, 2 weeks holds for you. I know you're off on a plane tomorrow. Coming up, we hear Dom, Joe and James's final thoughts. Let's go to our final thoughts. Dom Nicholls, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks, David. Bit of a whistle-stop tour, if I may. The latest on the attack on the Children's Hospital in Kyiv, we're hearing 2 killed, 16 injured. That will undoubtedly go up, I feel certain. The US Ambassador Bridget Brink, ambassador to Ukraine, saying on Twitter, this callous aggression, a total disregard for human life, jeopardising European and transatlantic security, is why leaders will make significant security commitments to Ukraine this week. I think that's an interesting comment. Obviously, NATO 75th meeting happening this week in Washington. If that is the case, and if the Ambassador Bridget Brink is correct there, I do hope that the NATO members make firmer pledges on things like air defence and also policy permissions. What's going to stop these missiles coming in? Air defence is good, but being able to destroy the airfields and the means of delivery is even better. 2 more very quick ones, if I may. I'm noting there's a demonstration in Berlin later today, 1900 local, so 7 p.m. local time, Berlin. If you're around, there's going to be a demonstration outside the Russian embassy. And just finally, let's not take our eyes off what else is happening. Yevgenia Kara-Murza, friend to the pod, she's obviously keeping the torchlight for her husband Vladimir Kara-Murza, who's been held by Russia, dual British citizen. She's just tweeted his lawyer has been denied access to the prison hospital where her husband Vladimir was taken without explanation last week. So noting what happened to Navalny, we keep our thoughts with Yevgenia and Vladimir Kara-Murza and keep an eye on what may or may not be happening where he is currently held in Russia.
Thank you very much, Dom. James Rothwell.
Yes, thanks. I think my final thought in relation to the bombing of the Children's Hospital in Kyiv is that it's shocking, but it's perhaps not surprising. We know that Russia has not just done this before in the war in Ukraine, but it used to do it an awful lot as well in the Syria campaign with its key ally Assad. And the bombing of a hospital or another civilian target, and then bombing the same target a second time when aid workers arrive on the ground is something that certainly happened quite a lot in Syria. And I think perhaps this speaks to this longer term issue in terms of the Western response to Russia, which is that they've known deep down for a very long time that this is how Russia operates. Unfortunately, it hasn't up until now prompted as strong a response as it could do, perhaps from European and American leaders. And so the big question is whether this latest attack might have that impact. I think it was very interesting what Dom said just a moment ago about that prediction of perhaps some much stronger security measures being agreed in Washington, and we will see where that leads.
Well, thank you very much, James and Dom. Joe, would you like the very final words?
Yeah, so fly off to the NATO summit tomorrow in Washington. Leaders have dinner tomorrow night, but the main bulk of the talks are on Wednesday and Thursday. I think I'm going to basically be trying to get all diplomats, politicians, officials, and ask them what are they going to do to stop this happening? Because before, I can tell you there's going to be promises of new air defense systems. We think the Americans are going to offer more Patriots or something like that. But it's clearly not enough. Russia is still attacking civilian targets. So we're going to have to go back, look at how that's done. Hamish got in touch with me this morning. I saw him listening earlier, and he mentioned, look, if the US, NATO, UK, France, NATO countries can help shoot down Iranian missiles destined for Israel, why can't they do the same for Russian missiles destined to civilian targets in Ukraine? And I think the Poles, interestingly, their sort of plan to do that from inside their borders is a potential starting point. So I think that's one of the questions. I'm trying to get hold of Viktor Orban, if not to some of the people on his trips to Kyiv, Moscow and Beijing, to challenge him and get our own sort of versions of what his account of the story is and will be. But yeah, lots of things to look out for. And I think it's going to be an interesting time, because moments like this, since the start of the full-scale invasion, February 2022, you look at the moments, especially before big international get-togethers, you look at Bucha helped redefine how many Western governments looked at treating Russia, how they supported Ukraine. And I think the targeting of a children's hospital is going to be up there with that sort of moment. There's lots of international backlash in words, but it's now time for we're going to see if people can respond with actions instead.
Well, thank you very much, Joe Barnes, James Rothwell, Dom Nicholls, and earlier Dr Jade McGlynn and Jimmy Ruston for joining us. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Rachel Porter, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.